think they all probably went to they decided to go to the drones. Drones. There's a drone, yeah, the drone and robotic meetup. So, yeah, it's like, oh well. No, I'm good. Just get back and relax. I feel like maybe we should move these chairs and bring the couches up front. Oh, you guys are on board? Yeah. All right, man. We need all the help we can get. How you doing? Matthew, nice to meet you. Mark. Cool.
Be very intimate. We're going to sit back here.
Yeah, no problem.
And you have to yell.
Yeah. No. If you know me, my voice usually carries pretty good. I usually don't have a problem with that.
I got a problem, right? All right.
Just warm it up. Hey, Alan, how you doing? It's been a long time, man. Fantastic. It's so good to see you. Man, yeah, good hug, man. Alan was like, I think at like the very first, I think maybe like the first meetup, and we're talking like 2015. Yeah. So he's a financial guy. He came out of, you're still have a home in Colorado, right?
No, I moved here now.
You moved here all the way? Yeah. But he had a particular financial product, right, that you sold to Bloomberg.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So it's like, he's like one of the early pioneers, saw blockchain. Awesome. And he knows patents too. How's that patent work? Did everything ever come out of that?
Yeah.
Did it?
Yep.
Cool. Okay, well it's still 7, so yeah, more. Good. All right, you guys are the hardcore ones. Yeah, this is good because the ratio.
Yeah.
All right. So like speak up, talk, ask questions. Don't, you know, you can interrupt me if you want. Go for it. So, right, so we're going to be talking about AI and blockchain, and in the context of supply chains and invoicing, right? Particularly financing of invoices. So this is a really cool, I find it really a cool area. Particularly, we're going to be looking at, in the case of our use case, is hemp, industrial hemp, but you know, it's universal, right? It could be automobiles, it could be water, it could be, you know, whatever, right? Because it's invoices, right? So, and supply chain. And every supply chain has multiple tiers, right? You have your front end, right? Whichever, at the end, I mean, at the most front, in the area of like retail, right? That would say like a Walmart, right? They're going to be at the front, and then they've got suppliers, right? And then those suppliers have suppliers, and suppliers have suppliers all the way down to the raw goods, right? And that's the area we're talking about. And in particular, while this thing's booting up, what this is going to talk about is really addressing those upstream stakeholders or participants in that supply chain. So they're the ones at the very bottom that are crucial to the supply chain, but they've got a lot of issues. They've got a lot of problems, especially when it comes to expanding invoice financing. You know, invoice financing is big business, right? You get your invoice, especially if you're well known, you got a good brand, right? And you're well known. I mean, you can find anybody that wants to finance you, right? On those invoices. But the farther as you move back in that chain, it becomes much more difficult to get that financing. And if, you know, you entrepreneurs in here, businessmen, you know how difficult, how competitive it is, your business, right? And the last thing you want the world to be knowing, especially your competitors, is your supply chain. So it becomes a very secretive, something you want to hold close. You don't go walk up to your competitor and say, hey, yeah, how do you make your widgets? Where do you get those? Like, take the bikes, the electric bikes out there. I was trying to explain this to my wife. It's like, you know, it's like the wheels. It's like, where do you get your wheels? Who does your paint jobs? Where do you get your electronics? Right? They're not going to give that information up because the competitor's going to go for it. Right? So there's a lot of secrecy, a lot of competitiveness in there. But at the same time, there's advantages to having relationships, sometimes with your competitors. Okay. This is weird. Tell me I'm just going to be talking. This is crazy. So we're going to have, this is going to be fun for me because it looks like Murphy's visiting and playing games with my mouse. So I wiped down my laptop before I came, and after I wiped it down, I started experiencing this problem with the mouse, the cursor specifically. So we'll see how well it plays with me. Did you bring your laptop?
Just like that.
Oh, that might work because before I uploaded the presentation to my cloud drive. Worst case, we'll see what happens. I mean, it's moving around, but it was jumping all around, so I don't know what was up with it. We'll see what happens. Hopefully, we'll be good. just in case. Well, just hold it back, just in case. The cursor is like flipping around on me. Really weird. Okay. Let me get my bearings here. I want to go. Okay, let's just go bring it up. See if the mouse sits still. If the cursor sits still, then that's a good sign, because it was like jumping around. And I'm always wary of infection. I mean, I'm a security guy, and it's like, I don't know if you, how much you guys get the rags and all that in the media, but it's like the hackers are really getting a hold on everything. I mean, they're just like, they're finding holes in everything. I just read an article the other day that the Siemens controller that's classified as the world's most secure controller, industrial controller now, was hacked. Fortunately by the good guys, the Israelis. And they were able to reverse engineer the protocol. Even though the protocol uses encryption, they were able to, because the protocol has flaws, they were able to reverse engineer the encryption and then create a dummy terminal, essentially, a master workstation that was able to mimic their workstation and be able to send fake commands and control, right, the controller, which is nuts. Fortunately, a lot of the hacking has to be on premise. You have to have hands-on, right? So if you're really diligent, then you're good, unless you have open access to your machines. If you have open physical access to your machines, then it's good, not good news. And it's like the other one that just came out too, out of DEF CON, was anything that attaches to your USB, especially like these guys. Who would ever think, right? Okay, this right here, right? Who would think? But inside of there, and they did it with Apple, which this is supposed to be one of the hardest ones to hack. In other words, to be able to take it apart and do it too. But they did. And they're going into production. And effectively, they put in a Wi-Fi, so within 300 feet. And a good hacker can boost up his antenna and be even further away. And if you're in a public area and you're on, like Starbucks, which is connected to the internet, then they can get you from anywhere in the world if you happen to have one of their cables, right? So what does that mean? That means that they could go into any store, right? And while, as a team, right, send the clerk to the back, come in, put their devices pre-packaged on the shelf, right? You go, you check out, you buy, right? You think you're buying a good one. The guy's selling you, he thinks it's his merchandise, but you're walking out with one, right? Or an associate gives you one, right? Or you go to a trade show and they're giving them out for free, right? Because they're branded and you want to get one, all right? So inside there is a wireless device that allows them to basically, as soon as you plug it in, they can, with their laptop or even with their iPhone or Android, basically open up a terminal on your machine and have full access. So beware. So anything that you know, and it's not the cable itself, but it's just the electronics to get access, the wireless access, right? Because it's miniature, it's very, very small. And for four grand, you can go buy a milling machine and make these little things custom. The actual circuit boards and the chips are, you know, a commodity. So anything from your lightning ports, anything that connects to it, you need to really treat that like your wallet. You just don't take it from any stranger, and you need to guard it. So that means, like, if you're in a convention and you're in your hotel room and you go down and you leave your laptop and your equipment up there, don't think, especially if you're a CEO or you're someone that has access to goods, they target you, you're a target, right? And they go pay the maid, you know, $1,000 to let you into the room. They go into the room and they swap out your goods. You go back to the office, you log in, right? Especially if, say, you're the CFO. Guess what? You're a host. Or you're an admin, or anybody, right? At a conference, you go back, you log in. You're a city worker. You go to a conference, you come back, you plug in. They get in, right? And they run the ransomware, and they lock down the city, they lock down the police departments, your host. So just be you know, this is real world. You got to really be paranoid. Okay. I always have to come away when I come up with things like that. I have to make sure I let that out because you know, I wouldn't feel right if I didn't share that information. You may already know it, but I need to share it because I can't hold that kind of stuff in. Okay, it's not us. It was last month. This is us. Okay, I want to get into it here. Let's go. Right, okay. Artificial intelligence and blockchain for supply chain invoice financing. Okay. So, does everybody in here know who I am? Sort of? No? No? Okay. So, just to give you a little background so you understand where I'm coming from. 2015, I basically was the father, I'm the father of, I like to say, father of enterprise blockchain, because 2015 I created this meetup because there was no brain share, nobody in Austin, really nobody anywhere that was talking about enterprise blockchain, right? My very first meetup at a restaurant, I got booed and food thrown at me by the anarchists because they didn't want to see blockchain go to the enterprise, right? Because the core of blockchain, the essence of blockchain comes out of Bitcoin, right? And it's all about decentralization. It's all about breaking down the power structure, going decentralized. Basically, it's the kids that don't want the parents, okay? So when you say, well, the parents are going to take this technology and make it theirs, they didn't like that. I'm an enterprise geek, 20, 30 plus years, being a hired gun for IBM, Sun Microsystems, and Big Six. I eat, drink, and sleep technology, and I love to integrate. I love to write code. I love to be on the edge. I have an insatiable desire to know what's coming or see what's coming and then master it and understand it. My biggest fault is that I'm usually 10 years out ahead of everything. So, you know, as an entrepreneur, that's not a good thing because it's all about timing, right? So I've never been very good about timing, except a couple times in my life. Once, back in the 80s, I invented a document imaging system, won a $50 million FDIC contract, but I ended up having a bad partner who went rogue on me and destroyed the whole thing. A couple years later, I saw web, and I saw SSL, and I saw e-commerce when everybody was saying, you know, no one ever give their credit card. But I thought different because I understood the technology and I knew it would happen. And again, I had a bad partner. I was building basically eBay, and we were doing good, but bad partner again. Money has a weird way of turning people. So that's, you know, some people have, you know, bad luck picking partners, but look at me, right? Anyway, so that's what I do. I eat, drink, and sleep this stuff. And right now, like I said, 2015, I ripped apart Bitcoin and I saw blockchain. The cryptocurrency piece didn't turn me on because I had already invented a cryptocurrency, what they call cryptocurrency. I didn't call it cryptocurrency, but effectively it was electronic cash. And it's still actually the best thing out there. But regardless, it was basically Venmo, right? But I was way ahead of my time. And I invented, I pivoted and made it into a multi-factor authentication application. And again, I was ahead of my time. And they didn't see any value in not knowing, they didn't see any, venture capitalists didn't see any value in customers not having to know their password, or not having, corporations not having to deal with passwords. right? Because I remember one said to me, you know, it took about probably 15 seconds to log in with my system without a password using just a smartphone, right? And the venture capitalist was at breakfast, and the venture capitalist said, "Mark, I love you, bro, but I can type my password in a lot faster than that. So fold up, go home," right? So where are we here today? It's all about blockchain. I predicted blockchain by 2019, 2020 would be zeitgeist in the enterprise. That 2019, that enterprise will start waking up, start picking it up. 2020, it's going to really catch its legs. By 2025, it'll be in your basement, like the transmission in your car and the plumbing in your home. You're not going to care about it until it breaks, okay? Because that's what blockchain is, right? It's the plumbing, it's pipes, it's modern day plumbing, it's transmission in your car. You try to demo it in front of an audience, and they fall asleep in the first 30 seconds. You can't, there's just no glitz to it, right? But for a geek, it's killer technology because you understand that for someone who works behind the curtain, it's magic. It's magic. Okay? Now, AI. So why am I talking about AI and what are my credentials? Well, 2003, I was doing AI, again, before AI, right? I mean, well, AI was in academics, but it wasn't zeitgeist like it is today, right? So I did, for the state of Texas, a project where I incorporated AI, very similar to what we're going to look at today, and generating dynamic JavaScript front ends. You didn't write the JavaScript, the system generated the JavaScript. These were complex healthcare regulatory applications, right, that had basically 30 pages to them that you would work through for compliance and for monitoring and regulating long-term care facilities in the state of Texas, right? And the state of Texas had, at that time, 2003, 5,700 of them, largest in the country. So I wrote that application, designed it, and created some technology that today is commonplace that we call microservices, right? Things like Spring Framework. I didn't invent it, but I was using the same type of technology as far as what we call inversion of control and things like that is metadata. So that's the AI that I was using. I was using AI. It was open source. And basically it allowed people to use a spreadsheet, domain experts to use a spreadsheet, and put in policies that would come from Washington, D.C. every week. The system would ingest that and then utilize and generate a dynamic set of rules that would then generate JavaScript that would then paint a front end contextually so that they could work through 30 different pages of these applications and these monitoring applications that were contextual, meaning that if you, on page 4, if you checked boxes 5 and 6, by the time you got to page 11, it generated particular types of fields and rules. And the big problem in IT was that every week they would get these policy statements from Washington, and they would hand them out to the developers, and of course the developers have to go through full lifecycle development, rip it apart the code to put in these new rules, get ripple effects. You've all been there, you know how that works. So I invented a system for them that eliminated all of that because they didn't have to touch any code because the code was being generated by AI. So today we're talking about combining, so that's it. So blockchains and AI. Right? And I've been doing blockchain from 2015. Every single blockchain there is out there, ripped it apart, have a lot of opinions about it from a technologist point of view. So where I'm hanging my hat today, is in Hyperledger. And I predicted that Hyperledger. I didn't predict Hyperledger, but when Hyperledger happened, that's when I started Hyperledger Meetup. But I did predict the year before that IBM would put it on the map, and they did. And so I created in 2015 Austin Blockchain Technology, right? And then predicted in 2016 that IBM or Microsoft, whichever would be first, would enter the game, because as an enterprise architect, systems integrator, I knew that this was going to hit the radar. In 2016, they created Hyperledger, and everything started from there. Now, everybody finally, and I predicted that eventually there would be coalescence, and all the Wild Wild West guys out there would come around because they'd go out, they would lose all their funding, they would go out of business, and they would see that the only road to riches would be the enterprise, and including Consensus, right? The big guy on the other side of the camp finally realized that maybe a year and a half ago, when they were on the verge of bankruptcy, did a full about flip, and now they're all about enterprise. And even Microsoft joined Hyperledger now. Oracle's on Hyperledger. Most recently, somebody else too. But anyway, Hyperledger is like the Apache foundation of open source. So Hyperledger is where you want to be if you're going to do blockchain in the enterprise. Right? And outside the enterprise, there's really no future. I don't care what people say. There always will be loyalists. There will always be Bitcoin. There will always be Ethereum. There will always be permissionless blockchains. But the government, the world powers will own their chains, and we will all work on their chains. Okay? So here we go. All right. So what we're going to cover tonight is the introduction, use case sample, methods, results, discussion, conclusion. Okay, introduction. Right. So let's see. Introduction. So what we're going to talk about is, well, let me just get into this. I'm much better. I think I have the Jerry Garcia gene, because if I try to play the chords, practice, then I screw up. I get lost. But if I just ad hoc and go free, then I let it roll, I'm much better. Okay. Our sample use case is going to be about hemp. Right? Problem statement. Okay. This is what I want to look at. Let's just go right into it. So we're talking about a supply chain. Okay, so we have, this is fictitious, right? And the context is industrial hemp. So I've started a company called Hemp Chain, which actually is a subsidiary. But Hemp Chain is about industrial hemp. It's not about marijuana, getting high and all that. It's about industrial hemp. And if you look at the history of hemp, it just blows your mind. And this meeting is not about that, but it's just, I'm telling you, there's over 25,000 products. Okay? In the 40s, it was outlawed, and what replaced it was polymers, plastic and steel. Okay? But it's back in vogue now. So all 50 states are doing industrial hemp. They've all passed a law, including Texas. And January 2020, Texas will start issuing license to farmers or anyone that wants to grow, and people can then begin making products. There's a $100 million plus investment in Houston that just came online, where they bought an old Maxwell Coffee House factory. They're turning it into a hemp processor, and they expect to process over 100 tons a year of hemp. And hemp is a beautiful savior for the farmers because it cleans soil, for one, and it's a great rotation crop, and it's anywhere from 4 to 15 times the revenue of any crop grown today. Okay? 1 acre, if you owned it vertically integrated, is worth $75,000 3 times a year to you as a farmer. 1 acre. Okay. So, Walmart is our retailer, global retailer, huge, multi-billion-dollar retailer, and they have a manufacturer of a product called Ben and Marge Hemp Products. And recently, they did some trials, and they can't keep the products on the shelves. So they're going to expand big time. So they told Ben and Marge, you got a hit, we want more products. We're going to expand, we're going to go global. So Ben and Marge has, and I'm dumbing this all down, there's a lot more players in this particular supply chain, as any supply chain. Right? But we got to dumb it down. So Ben and Marge has two key suppliers. One's Blue Sky Processor, and one is Acme Hemp Packaging. So the Blue Sky Processor is responsible for giving them one of their core ingredients, which is the processed hemp. That Ben and Marge take that processed hemp, and then out of that they make a number of different products, from cups to clothing to food products to cosmetics, etc. Now Blue Sky Processor, right, has also a supplier, and in order for them to process, they need hemp, right? And they have contracts with 3 different suppliers: Mary Jane Hemp Farm, Uncle Bob Hemp Farm, and Jimmy's Hemp Farm. But we're going to be talking about Mary Jane tonight. Okay? So when we look at it, it goes Mary Jane, Blue Sky, Ben and Marge, and Walmart. Now, everybody knows Walmart. And now everybody knows about Ben and Marge. So if you think of like Ben and Jerry's ice cream, so you know that, right? And anybody would love to get in on that business. Okay, if you're a financier, Ben and Jerry, yeah, can I finance your invoices? No problem. Blue Sky Processor. Well, I process for Ben and Jerry. I sell Ben and Jerry cream. Okay, well, I sell the hemp, the processed hemp. Okay, but here's the thing. You're going back. This guy doesn't really have a problem getting financed. This guy got a problem getting financed. That guy up there, big time problem getting financed. Nobody wants to finance them. Okay? But guess what? They get invoices, because when this guy doubles and says, hey, we're quadrupling your business, you know, you need to increase your product, right? So that goes out to this guy and says, hey, we need to double down on this. We need much more product. Can you do it for us? Well, who doesn't want to do it, right? If your customer comes to you and says, yeah, I want to double up, and you're selling them $10 million worth of goods, and they tell you, yeah, I want to do 20 million, what are you going to do? Say no? No, you're going to figure out a way to make that happen. That's your dream, right? So yeah, okay, so they all have contracts. In this case, they're basically like 60-day contracts on these invoices, right? But in this business, everybody doesn't wait to get paid, right? So there's a side business out there that's a financier that you bring them that invoice and you say, hey, look, I got a $10 million invoice here. I'm going to get paid in 60 days, but I need $5 million right now. It's like, hey, yeah, we can do that, especially if you're Ben and Marge, no problem. I can take that money all day. I'll take that all day. Blue Sky, well, you know, we got to talk about it. Mary Jane, no, I don't think so. You're not going to get anybody to try to help you out. Right? So she's got problems. So the point is that the farther you go on these supply chains, the harder it is to get invoice financing. But yet when you look at it, that's the core. Because if this guy don't get his raw product, his hemp, this whole chain suffers. Right? And if you happen to be the financier of this guy, right, you suffer. You're at risk. So keep that in mind. Okay. So what we're going to talk about tonight is the methods to solve this problem. And it's not just hemp, right? It's a universal. You can apply this to any supply chain. Right? Automobile parts, whatever, it doesn't matter. Bayesian network modeling, that's the AI. Okay? And private blockchains. Now, in the AI, you probably heard a lot of, mostly it's always about neural networks, right? Whether it's convolutional neural networks, recurrent neural networks, or the latest zeitgeist, which is generative adversarial networks, GANs, which are responsible for what you've all heard about deep fakes. I'm sure you have, right? Deep fakes, right? So there's really two sides of the AI camp. AI is like a split brain. One side of it is, it's all statistical, right? But the one side is about these neural networks that model the equations like the way the brain works. So it's really about ingesting a lot of data. You're looking at 10 million pictures of a cat, and then you have a circuitry that can recognize a cat. Because the chances are that what you look at, you can recall from one of those 10 million pictures, a cat. Where the other side of the camp is really about probability equations, right? It's about looking at the world from an inference model, from experience and fuzzy logic, right? It's about making relationships and then making a probability statement and then going with that. And they're really at odds a lot, okay? So the neural network guys believe that they're the Holy Grail. And typically the Bayesian guys believe that they're the Holy Grail. But they're going to come together, right? And they can really, there's really synergy there. They're really not that far apart, okay? It's just that with Bayesian, you don't need a lot of the heavy lifting. And maybe that's part of the equation too, because if you're running a neural network company, you might have a supply chain, you might have an intrinsic value where it's all about your data. And your strategic value or advantage is all the data, right? So he who owns the data owns the equation, like hello Google, right? But if you have a different model and it's really not about all the data, that sort of levels the field, right? Well, that's the Bayesian guys. So while they're one side of the camp on the neural network side is looking at, say, 10 to the 2, right? The Bayesian guys are looking at 10 times 2 to the 3. Okay? And they both are equal for the outcome. The other part of the equation is blockchain. Private blockchain. Enterprise blockchain. Okay? And we're looking at combining the two together. The Bayesian networks, which is about probability. Probability of what? Probability of looking at Mary Jane up on that, way down that tier, and whether it's a good investment to finance her invoices or not. So Bayesian is about networks. Well, you create networks of networks, right? And each network is an inference model, a probability statement. And you end up combining these together, right, in mathematical equations of probability. And then you combine them. So you could scale it out to millions of these networks, right? And that's where machines come in handy for us. So for us, we're going to be looking at Supplier. We're going to break it down very simple, right? But the Bayesian network modeling is one of our methods. Okay. So we're going to look at Tier 1 Supplier and Walmart supply chain feeding into a supplier profile. In conjunction with that, we're going to look at a financial incentive submodel. And that's going to be based upon a credit rating and a financial rewards. And both of those will feed into the financial incentive. So between the financial incentive and the supplier profile, those are going to be our two key inputs that we're going to want to look at. So when we look at Mary Jane's hemp farm and she gives us an invoice, we want to know about her supplier profile, right? and the financial incentive. And each one of these ellipses is a probability statement. We're not going into the math, but each one of these is a complex animal in itself that takes input. Credit rating is pretty straightforward. We can all grasp what a credit rating is, right? You go out, get a credit report, right? But even getting a credit report has a probability to it, right? How credible is that credit report? So do you rely on one credit report, or do you go get 3 credit reports, right? And then what do you augment that with as well? So it's really about inputs. A lot, the more, and that's sort of where, you know, big data, not big data, but you do need inputs. So the more inputs, the better, but you certainly don't need millions of inputs. It would be nice to have millions of inputs, but you don't need millions of inputs. But you do need some probability of the data, of that statement that you want to make. Financial, and the thing is that in the Bayesian world, most of it, when you break these networks down, you want to break them down in a granularity where you can get down to a binary state, where it's yes, no, red, black, blue, green, wet, dry, right? A binary state, if possible. But Bayesian will also work for you if you can't render that binary state and it's somewhere gray, somewhere between white and black. Whereas if you're in the neural network world, that's going to be a problem, because it needs to know basically what color it is, right? It's looking at a number, right? It's not going to look at a probability. It's going to look at a number. So we want to combine these together. So we build up the supplier profile subnetwork with our supplier profile, which has 2 inputs. We build up our financial incentive subnetwork, right, which has 2 inputs. We feed that, those 2, we combine those 2 in our network, and we get a perception of risk. I like that. Okay? So you can imagine a dashboard, and you're that guy that makes the loan decision, and you're looking at this number, and it's telling you perception of risk. The other thing within invoice financing that I didn't mention was supply chain stability. I mentioned it implicitly because if Mary breaks down, if there's a natural event, and let's just say there's floods, right, and the crops are wiped out, well, guess what? There's no raw supply. So the processor, no matter how many contracts he has, doesn't have the raw material. Well, if he doesn't have the raw material to process, what can he give to his customer? Zilch, 0. Right? So what does that mean for us, the consumers? It means empty shelves. What does that mean financially? It means possibly somebody's going to go bankrupt and go out of business. So that supply chain has a stability equation as well. Okay? And that stability is driven by a lot of natural events, as well as financial events, competitive events, right? Beyond just what we're looking at with invoice financing. But invoice financing also interplays with the stability. Because if those upstream suppliers don't get financing and they don't have cash reserve to meet the expanding marketplace, they're not going to be able to make the supply. If they don't make the supply, then there's not going to be added product on the shelves. There's going to be shortages. And when there's shortages, then that's going to end up being bad for the brand. Right? And the retailer doesn't want angry customers. Especially if they spend $10 million running ads and you come in and the product's not there. So supply chain stability and that invoice financing has an implicit link to it. So we develop this perception of risk through our Bayesian networks, these sub-networks. We're only looking at 2. But in reality, you develop literally perhaps tens, hundreds, or thousands of these. Right? And they'll feed into not a single oval, but they could feed into multiple ovals that will build up a hierarchy that feed all the way down. Right? And each one of those are based upon, each one of those are holding a probability number, something between, statistically, 0 and 1. And then it's that perception of risk that feeds into the invoice financing decision, yes or no, do I want to finance them? That's what the star means. This is really what we're after, the end game, is this decision and this. Because they both play together. And then out here, what feeds into the stability, secondarily, is that lower tier funded by the invoice finance company? Because if you're funding, say you're funding Blue Sky, the processor, well, and Mary Jane comes to you and wants you to fund her, that's going to impact your decision. And the thing to keep in mind is that this is dark knowledge. People don't divulge their supply chain. So Mary Jane can't say, oh, we'll call so-and-so, and they'll tell you, yeah, I'm a supplier. No, they don't do that. It's very secretive. They want to keep it in the family. So that which creates the quandary for these these upper tiers for getting recognized and being able to prove that they're part of the supply chain. And it's a catch-22 because if that's what we're talking about. It's like, well, wait a minute, but I'm part of the supply chain. You don't finance me, you guys aren't going to get your product. But yet, no one wants to tell you that I am part of your supply chain. They might not even know it because, the processor doesn't want to tell Ben and Marge where they get their hemp. Because maybe Ben and Marge decide, you know what, we got enough money, Marge, why don't we just open up our own processor and cut those guys out and go get the hemp ourselves? We'll bump up our margins by 10% doing that. That's a good idea, Ben. That's a good idea, Ben. Let's do that. So, nobody wants to divulge where they get their goods for their products. So this gives us a nice table to look at on the nodes. So each one of these, or nodes, you call them nodes in the model, right? The way they connect up. So over here we have 3 columns. We have our Bayesian network model that we're building, the nodes in the model, and the states for those nodes. So the first one is supplier profile. We're only looking at 2. Remember, there could be hundreds or thousands of these, okay, in the reality. That's why we have computers. Okay. But we're looking at supplier profile. And for that, we have 3 nodes. Well, 2 nodes, I'm sorry, and a result. So we have tier 1 supplier, yes or no. Walmart supply chain, yes or no. And then the supply profile. Low risk or high risk. Financial incentive, the credit rating, and the financial rewards. The credit rating, did they pass it or did they fail it? Financial rewards, additional and standard. So what that means is that the vendor in this case, who's asking for financing, is willing to give you additional terms instead of the standard terms. So they realize, they say, okay, well, you know, we'll give you, instead of 60, we'll give you, you know, 90 days and a 20% discount. Oh, okay. Well, that matters. Or is it just standard? 60 days, no discount. And then the result will be, is it compelling to finance them or is it not compelling? Now we're going to combine these two, the financial incentive and the supplier profile, right? They're going to feed in to our overall model. Again, remember, we're just feeding in two. In the real world, you'll feed in hundreds or thousands. Get your, eventually drill down to a final overall model. So we have our supplier profile and our incentive. So when we feed it in, we're looking at, is it a low risk or a high risk? Okay. Compelling or not compelling? Those two inputs. And that gives us our perception of risk. Acceptable risk or unacceptable risk. From there we have invoice financing decision. Want to fund them, fund the supply invoices, or do not. Again, see, they're binary decisions. Makes it very easy. A lot of the neural networks are not binary. Okay? A lot of it is what I think probably 80% is regression. So it's one of these. It's a curve. It's a number. Somewhere on that line. Somewhere on that line. And somewhere in that line, there's a pile cluster. And if you're in that cluster, that looks pretty good. Lower tier is funded. That matters, yes or no. And then stability. Is it stable or is it unstable? Second half of our methods, so summing that up. So we have our Bayesian network. The Bayesian network, to be effective, needs input. The input goes into these nodes, right? And these nodes are very specific attributes or characteristics of your model. And there is a little bit of art and science. There's an art and science to it. It's not black and white. Typically with the Bayesian network, it's iterative. You're going to learn. You're not going to just pull it up. It's not going to be obvious to you, right? So, because the world is complex, right? And you're going to need to make it iterative. So when you're looking at this, these models actually evolve over time as you learn. But given what we have, you end up with, right, that Bayesian output that tells you binarily what's your risk, to fund them or not fund them, and is it stable or not stable. Now the second half of our equation is blockchains, private blockchains. So, you recognize that. Just to give you an overview of a typical enterprise blockchain application that's somewhat generic in nature, but universal, and all the moving parts. So up here in the top left, we start with applications. That's an enterprise, and they have a bunch of applications. To the right, they have customers. there's a third-party auditor in this. The gold is a blockchain provider. And the blue belongs to the enterprise. So typically, in this case, when you draw these things out, and this is generic, it could be any type of application, but the customers are running transactions, right, with the enterprise, whether it's e-commerce transactions, financial transactions, loans, whatever, right? They're running transactions. Those transactions from the enterprise are going to feed into blockchain via the blockchain provider's API. So this is typically sitting up in the cloud, software as a service. So my enterprise application sends transactions to the API. The API talks to a smart contract written specifically for my applications. The smart contract then is responsible for accessing the blockchain itself, which typically is broken down into three. We're looking at Hyperledger, and this is pretty universal, but very specifically, say Fabric, Hyperledger Fabric, which is the de facto enterprise blockchain. You have a blockchain node, right? That's just a computer server, right? And it has the ledger, right? That's your immutable truth, right? Your source of truth, it's immutable, and it's a ledger, perpetual ledger, right? And then there's a world state database that represents the current, the head, the front of that ledger. That's why we call it world state. And this is specific to Fabric. Doesn't mean that you can't go back in time and look at the ledger. You know, if you want to go back in time and look at it, you can. But that's not what most people do. They want to look, you know, when they look at it, they're contextual. They want to know right now what's going on. Right? That's world state. But the immutability is down here in the ledger. And then whatever the current updates, that front, are reflected in the database. And typically based upon resources, how much history is maintained here. You might, you know, if you're a financial institution, you may be, by, you know, regulation, you may have to hold 7 years of history, so that you can literally go in and query 7 years of immutable history. But yet the ledger may have been living, let's go out in time, 20, 30 years. So you can go back, literally look at 20 years ago what the world looked like then. Now, because it's a blockchain, the beautiful thing about blockchains, right, are they're decentralized. There's not one database, one node, right? There's N nodes. There could be 2 nodes, or there could be 2,000 nodes, or 200,000 nodes. Okay? It all depends. In this simple case, right, there's 2 nodes. There's the enterprise node, right, that they own, that they're, even though where this lives, it may live in the cloud, it may live in their database, right, in their glass house. It may live in a third party that they have a contract with that is their managed service provider. Doesn't matter. But it's their node, right? And there's another node, in this case, by an independent provider, the SaaS service. So there's always 2 copies, minimum. And they're completely decoupled. That's important. So this node cannot get a hold of this node. These guys can't go over there and touch this node. They're not going to have administrative access to it. Hands off. They can't get to it. And vice versa. this guy can't go over here and get to this node. So they're not going to do a backup and replace this one. They're not going to do a backup on this and replace this one when the auditor comes. Okay? They're independent. But because of the way they work, when the transactions come in and this smart contract executes on those transactions, right? The blockchain node does its magic and says, who's my peers in my network? And it sends the transactions to those peers. So this guy receives copies of everything going on over there. And he has a complementary smart contract too. So he processes the transaction. Together they reach consensus. So yeah, 1 + 1 is 2. Yeah, 1 + 1 is 2. Write it to the ledger. Thank you. Update the world state. Thank you. Yep. Okay. So you see 1, customer sends a transaction, checking in. Transaction number 2, step 2, check-in transaction, boom, smart contract. Oh, got check-in transaction, write it to the ledger, send it over here. Check-in transaction, okay, check-in. Data on the blockchain, 2 separate. Now, after that, the customer, through a provided application, whether that whoever provides, in this case, the SaaS service is providing the application for the enterprise. Even though that application represents the enterprise, but it's being managed by this provider. Doesn't have to be. That block could be blue, but because it's handled by the provider in this particular context, it decouples the liability and increases the trust between the customer and the enterprise, because the customer knows this is a third-party provided application, not manipulated or controlled by the enterprise. Even though they're querying the enterprise blockchain node, which is fine. But at some point in time, there's an annual or quarterly audit that takes place by an independent third party. That independent third party accesses the same application, but instead of querying the enterprise blockchain node, the provider has a special pathway to where it queries their copy of that enterprise blockchain ledger. So now the independent auditor can look over here and say, hey, 1 + 1, 2, date, timestamp, cool. Okay. And of course they could also run this one too and pair them up. So that's generally what a blockchain application is going to look like. Now that's pretty simple, right? Because there literally, could be hundreds of nodes, hundreds of enterprises involved. Now when you start thinking about what we're doing with a supply chain, when you look at applications and customers and nodes, right, it scales out and becomes far more complex. So much more complex that you wouldn't be able to put it up on this board and humanly grasp what's going on. But effectively and fundamentally, what's happening right here, right, is what would happen at scale. So the methods in private blockchain for our application for invoice financing, okay? What's unique here that you haven't heard about, or is not zeitgeist out there today, right? Because all the blockchain companies want to own the world. They want one blockchain. They want it to be their blockchain. But that's not going to happen because the web would never existed one server, one browser. So they're going to be many blockchains, but they all have to interoperate. So in our case, right, and in others, we're going to have what we call cross-channel, atomic cross-channel transactions. Okay? If you come from a database world, it's synonymous with what's called two-phase commit. So you have two replicated databases, and before one commits, they do what's called two-phase commit, and it's a complex protocol, and it says, okay, I'm going to write this now. Are you ready? You're going to write yours? Yeah, I'm writing mine. Well, what are you writing? Oh, I'm writing one. Oh, you writing one? Yeah, I'm writing one. Ready? 1, 2, 3, write. What'd you write? One. Good. Commit? Yeah, commit. So, in the future, very soon, right, we being the first hemp chain, which, by the way, is really a brand owned by Transfer Technology, so the underlying technology, but the brand hemp chain is applying that technology to the use case, in this case, industrial hemp. But we realized a long time ago, okay, about, you know, you have to be agnostic. Blockchain A, blockchain B, vendor A, vendor B, the world has to play. You have to be able to communicate. Your bank will have one blockchain, your manufacturer will have one blockchain, your financier will have a blockchain, and you're going to have your blockchain. But you all need to be able to talk together and be able to communicate so that you can transfer data, right? And because we know and we accept, as our maturity level increases, we become very comfortable understanding that fundamentally we all look alike, but we're the same. I mean, we all look different. Say that backwards. We all look different, but we're the same, like in this room. We don't all have to be clones of each other, but yet we all know we got hearts. Right? So blockchains are the same way. We all know we got immutable ledgers. Now, implementation is a different issue. But we understand, and our maturity level will be where we understand that we can trust that bank's blockchain, we can trust that manufacturer's blockchain, right? Because the immutable ledgers, right? Immutable ledger, immutable ledger. So when this one says, I got one over here, and I'm sending you one, write one. That's good. So T0, T1, these are the tiers that we looked at in the supply chain. So each tier is a separate blockchain. When you look at Hyperledger Fabric, it has this core concept called channels. And when you create a relationship, you create channels. And you can have one or more parties on a channel. So, and each channel is a blockchain, a separate immutable ledger. And that channel is what's transmitting transactions between the parties to that relationship. So, supplier, manufacturer, the whole supply chain. Okay? Now, the issue of data privacy, in the case of IBM and channels, which IBM is the creator of Fabric, right? And they're sort of the main force behind its evolution. It's gone through many, many evolutions, and they had to learn through each one about the importance of privacy. Okay? The actual application of this in the real world. Because when you have end parties transacting, like in that supply chain, not everybody is going to want to see or broadcast their information to everybody else. But in a naive implementation, 18 people are in the supply chain, and I send out a price list to Joe. Everybody gets to see my price list. Now, when I want to go to Mary and get a deal, Mary says, oh, yeah, I know what you're charging, Bob. No, no, no. You're not getting that price. Bob gets that price. So you can see how that breaks down real quick. So you have to have privacy among these parties at a subset level. Okay? So this is where we're currently evolving to. The rest of the world on when I say that, I mean blockchains. They're recognizing that. And when you do these rich transactions, right, and you involve a lot of parties, right, you can't broadcast all that data. It doesn't work in the real world. So you have subsets of data that's protected between subsets of parties. So here we have our private blockchain identifiers. We have our participants that are in those particular blockchains. So T0 and T1, that's the Walmart and Ben and Marge. They have a channel, right, that they talk and they do transactions on, and no one else can see what's going on but them. And that's the participants right here. Walmart at tier 0, Ben and Marge hemp products on tier 1. On tier 1, tier 2, this particular blockchain, you see that Ben and Marge is also on this, it spans, but not T0. So Walmart doesn't know what Ben and Marge is doing with the processor, because Walmart would love to cut these guys out and own the whole game. Okay? That's not going to happen, because this is private. So Ben and Marge hemp products on tier 1 with their partner, Blue Sky Processor, who's a tier 2 supply chain stakeholder, and Acme Hemp Packaging. Okay? Tier 2. Now, what's unique in this particular setup, at least within Fabric, is that the transactions that Ben and Marge do, even though they travel on this common channel, right, are protected in a way that Acme can't see the transactions that Ben and Marge is doing with the processor. So if there's somebody over here who is doing corporate espionage and they want to go tell another processor, because that processor says, hey, I know you're part of that Ben and Marge, right? I'll give you $1 million if you tell me X, Y, Z, because I want to be their processor. It's worth $10 million a year to me. I just need to know what their price is so I can undercut them, and what their terms are so that I can give them better terms. Well, Acme's not going to be able to find that out. Okay? At least not in our blockchain. Other blockchains, be careful. Be very careful. Okay? Remember what I said. That's important. Doesn't sound simple, but these are the little things that eat people's lunch until they figure it out. Okay, so now we move on down. We have tier 2, tier 3. That's the processor on tier 2 with Mary Jane Hemp Farm. On tier 3, Uncle Bob Hemp Farm and Jimmy's Hemp Farm. Well, heck, all 3 of these guys are competitors, but they all supply hemp to the processor, Blue Sky. But Mary and Uncle Bob literally are, that's Mary's the niece. That's how Mary got started. So she consults a lot with Uncle Bob. But she don't want Uncle Bob knowing what the terms are, because Uncle Bob will want to get a piece of the action, or make life a little bit harder for Mary. He's like, Mary, you don't need to make $2 million a year. You only need $1 million. I want to take $500,000 from my charity. But Jimmy's cutthroat. He wants all that business. Okay. But these channels are protected the transactions are protected among these parties. But that's that particular identifier. Now we have tier 3 and Finn. Okay, now this is specific to Mary Jane Hemp Farm on tier 3. And an invoice financier called Joe. Okay? Mary found Joe because Uncle Bob knows Joe for 30 years. It says Joe's honest. Joe won't give you up. He's a man of integrity. You can trust Joe. Go talk to Joe. He'll help you out. Then you have Tier 3, which is strictly Mary Jane Hemp Farm on Tier 3 and Uncle Bob Hemp Farm on Tier 3. You say, what? Tier 3s. Why? Well, guess what? Mary can't grow enough hemp to satisfy the immediate order. So she is hooking up with Uncle Bob because Uncle Bob has got some extra supply coming in. And it's a one-off transaction. Because if Mary doesn't meet that immediate need, she's going to lose out. And then she's not going to get a second chance. So she needs to meet the immediate need, and concurrent to that, begin expanding her business. Needs to go out, lease new land, and start growing more hemp. 2 different tasks. We didn't talk about that, but these are some of the complexities when you start peeling that onion. When these supply chains start growing, right? It's like you have immediate needs. You want to go meet the immediate need, and that might mean going and talking with a competitor, collaborating with another competitor for a one-off deal to get supply without them knowing the details of where it's going, while at the same time you begin building out your longer-term plan, because it takes time for expansion. I got to go find another 100 acres somewhere. I got to go get seed. I got to plant. I got a lot of things to do. Obviously, I'm not going to do all of that and meet my supplier, Blue Sky Processor, who needs it in 3 months. But within 6 months, I'll be ready to rock and roll. I just need the first 3 months to expand, plant, and then I'll have my harvest and I'll be able to continuously supply. But in the meantime, I got this other immediate need. And that's where Uncle Bob comes in. But she doesn't want Uncle Bob knowing certain terms that she has with Blue Sky. Because they probably have different terms, different pricing. And also, the supply chains are never consistent, right? They're always fluctuating. So there's always relationships. So there's always going to be times where she might be, 10 tons short, and she needs to go, hey, Uncle Bob, you got an extra 10 tons, or you know where I can go get it? Got to meet my quota here. Okay. Tier 3. And then Finn is the next identifier, which is Joe, the financier. And then finally, we didn't talk a whole lot about this guy down here, the certification authority, which is the hemp and licensing. In the world of industrial hemp, okay, this is critical. And it's important in the context of blockchain because no matter, you might have your 100 tons, but if it doesn't test at 0.3, you're not going to be able to sell it. You're going to have to burn it. Also, you don't want to be buying hemp from somebody that's not licensed. So that's where blockchain comes in, because that immutable ledger will tell you, oh yeah, they're licensed, oh yeah, they just got tested, and it's at 0.3, so it's all good to go. You're not going to go hand over money and then have the regulator come out and say, oh yeah, you bought that Uncle Bob hemp, and we just got the test reports back, and it's 0.4. You can't sell it to Blue Sky. You got to go burn it. What? I just spent 500 grand on it. I'm sorry. You got insurance, right? Okay, so that's private blockchain and what we're looking at. Now results. What's the results of this? So when you run the model, the Bayesian model, right, with no evidence entered, no evidence. That's a key term when you're looking at Bayesian that they use, evidence. Evidence is like, it's pretty obvious. Evidence, it means that's the number. That's the input. So in this case, it's 50-50. Is it a tier 1 supplier? We don't know. Are they part of the supply, this wonderful supply chain? Because if they are, that's important. We don't know. Okay, well, what's their profile? Flip a coin. That's Bayesian. So that's running it with no evidence entered. Okay. Now run the model with knowledge that the supplier is in the supply chain. So we know they're in the supply chain, but we don't know if they're a tier 1 supplier. But we know they're in the supply chain. Cool. So what's their supplier profile look like? Well, not too bad. It's got a 79.5 low risk and a 20.5 high risk. So depending upon your policies, right, within your own company, what's your appetite for risk, right? What does your actuarials tell you you can risk? Oh, it's got to be 80. Oh, man. Are you sure about that? God, we need to bump that up a little. No, actually it's 75. Oh, well, we're good to go. I can get a commission. Running the model with knowledge that the supplier is a tier 1. Well, we don't know if they're part of the supply chain or not, but we do know they're a tier 1 supplier. So now what's their supplier profile look like? Ooh, it's not as good. 69.5 on the low side, and the high risk is 30. Oh, wow, we might want to pass on them. Depends on how desperate I am to make my quota. Okay? I mean, 69 is pretty good. 69%, I'll take that. Okay? Knowledge that the supplier is a tier 1 and they're part of the supply chain. Whoa, now, oh my God, that's a slam dunk. 99 on the low side, low risk, and 1 on the high risk. So, I mean, that's a no-brainer. Okay? So, that brings me to the other point is, I'm working this in the context of a human looking at a dashboard. But the reality is a machine will do this. You can automate this process. Because once you tell the machine what's your risk appetite, right, the machine will automatically decide for you. No, humans don't like that. Because there's a lot of people that are employed in finance that make these decisions. But tomorrow, they're out of a job. At least this job. Because this is a job for what we call robotic process automation. And you don't bribe them either. You don't find out who makes that decision and say, hey, I heard your daughter applied for Harvard. I can guarantee you that she gets into Harvard. But here's what I need. Now the other side. So that was looking at the supplier profile, remember? That was the supplier profile, but we have another side to it. The financial incentive. And always keep in mind, now we're looking at just 2 of these. There could be hundreds or thousands of these. That's the power and beauty of this model, this scenario that I'm painting for you. So again, we run it with no evidence. Right? 50, 50, 50, 50, flip a coin. We run it where the supplier is offering additional financial rewards. Oh. Well, we don't know what their credit rating is. But, guess what, boss? They're giving us really great terms. What is the financial incentive? 59, compelling, almost 60, and 40, not compelling. Well, I don't know. 60-40? Now we run the model, and the supplier passes the credit check, but there's no rewards. Hey, that's okay. You pass the credit check because look, 89 on compelling and 10 on not compelling. A done deal. Computer says, boom, you got it. We're financing you. Or I mean, we're not making a decision, but I mean this half of the equation. Right? This particular bot says, oh yeah, this is good to go. You want to do this? I got 89 here. So then that goes. Remember, it goes to the supplier, which we'll see later. But this side, this bot says, oh yeah, I got a strong number over here, 89. And of course, we look at it where they fail the credit rating. But they're going to offer financial rewards. I don't think so. You can offer me the world, baby, but your credit sucks and we're not giving you any money. This is not compelling. So I don't care. Because, but imagine within a human scenario and not a bot scenario, oh yeah, we're going to put I guarantee your daughter's going to Harvard or Stanford. Take your pick. All you need to do is just check that box. But that's not going to happen. You know why? Because we got a blockchain. And that stuff goes on a blockchain. And it's immutable and you can't change it. And it's already there. Think about that for a moment. What it does to the fraud part of this equation. And that affects all of our lives because we pay for the fraud. Now, we got a pass credit and a standard terms. Well, there we go. Yeah, okay, it's compelling and we're going to do it. It's an 80-20 scenario. Not bad. Looks pretty good. Now we got passes the credit and they're going to give us additional terms. Mary wants it bad. Wants it now. No questions asked. 99.9 compelling. Done deal. So these are the Bayesian models that are running, right? Probability equations. You can go and Google Bayes' theorem, learn all the gory details, right? What it's based upon. The history is rich, and it feeds right into something called Markov chains, how to deal with fuzzy logic, things that are unknown, right? How to beat Vegas. Now we put this together. So we have our financial incentive subnetwork that we just looked at. Each of those scenarios based upon the inputs. Remember, and there could be hundreds or thousands of inputs. And then we have our supplier profile that we looked at before that. Again, could be hundreds or thousands of inputs. They're going to feed into this perception of risk. Okay. Perception of risk feeds down into the invoice financing decision. Fund them or don't fund them. And it feeds into this lower tier is fundable. And then both of these feed into supply chain stability. Because you got to remember, supply chain stability is critical. It's one of those little side things that if you don't understand it, could eat your lunch. It's like, we funded them, but we still lost money. What happened? Oh, well, it wasn't stable. We didn't fund them, but it was stable. That doesn't matter. Who cares? But it needs to be stable. We don't want to be funding things in a supply chain that's unstable. What does that mean? Well, you funded A, but B didn't get funding. And B feeds into that product. That product didn't get made. So, supplier is in the supply chain. What does that mean? So what do we get? Perception of risk. 61, acceptable risk. 38, unacceptable. Now the thing about Bayesian networks is they're cumulative or aggregates. So they feed in. They're not absolute. So when they feed in, they taint the lower nodes down below. Because the lower nodes are not, they're equations, but they just don't rely upon what you're telling them. You could think of them as being weighted in a way. So what I'm saying is it's not a pass-through. Okay? And that's really what makes them extremely powerful. Okay? Because when you think about that at scale, how those numbers will percolate down. And something over here looks really good, something over here looks sort of shady, but yet, what does that mean down here in the middle where you're going to end up making the decision? So over here is the lower tier fundable? We don't know. But what about our decision? Well, we got a 61 to fund it and a 38 that says don't fund it. Well, okay. So what's that do? Stability? Stability, ooh, it's almost 50-50. Ooh, that's not really that attractive. But we need to make quota, so let's go for it. Roll the dice. Supplier is in the supply chain, and they did pass the credit rating assessment. What's the perception of risk? 85. That's nice. What's the invoice financing decision? 84. Funded. Are they in the lower tier? No, we don't know. Okay, well, what about, does that do to supply chain stability? Puts it up to a 70? Okay, well, let's write the check. So they pass the credit check. It's not a tier 1 supplier, and the lower tier is funded by the invoice company. Okay, so what's the perception of risk? 77, a little bit lower than it was, right? The invoice financing decision is a 77. The lower tier is fundable is 100. What's that do to supply chain stability? 76. Let's write them a check. So just that statement, you can see how if you try to parse that out and make a decision, it'd be hard to decide. But these chains like this really can, and again, these are adaptable. These are things that, again, remember, they're being fed by input, so they're susceptible. Garbage in, garbage out. So they're always going to want to be tuned, changing nodes, adding nodes, making sure your inputs are good, changing what your inputs are. So it's not black and white. That said, that opens it up to the complementary side of AI, the other side of AI, which is beautiful at doing regression testing, looking at big data and making decisions on that big data, right, from a regression curve, and using that as a complementary to the inputs, deciding on what are the better inputs. Does that input really matter a lot? What's the impact? And you're not going to know that looking at one-off cases. But when you're a large entity and you're funding a lot of these things, then that's going to be complementary, and it will help you understand and tune these Bayesian models. The decisions made not to fund, period. 2 or 3, although the lower tier is funded by the financier. We don't care. We're not funding it. That's a done deal. That's just a no-brainer there. So, now we're looking at at the end. And the sequence diagram of the transaction, or not the transaction, but the flow of this thing across these blockchains. So over here we have our T2, T3 with our Blue Sky processor on tier 2. We have Mary Jane on T2, T3 and T3 Fin. Okay. We have Finance Joe on his T3. He's part of T3, Fin, and Fin. And then the blockchains over here, we have our T2, T3 blockchain, our T3 Fin blockchain, and then our Fin blockchain. So we start out where Blue Sky, the processor, deploys a smart contract, supply smart contract, and uploads a supply agreement signed by Blue Sky to the T2, T3 blockchain. Mary Jane Hemp Farm, number 2 step, fetches the supply agreement signed by Blue Sky from the blockchain. Step 3, she uploads the countersigned supply agreement to the T2, T3 blockchain. Then, a blockchain establishment request from Mary to Finance Joe. Step 5, deploy the financing smart contract to the T3 blockchain. At that point, we begin the actual request invoice financing. Mary issues it to the T3 Fin blockchain. The fetch countersign agreement from the T3 back to the T2, T3 that was established way up there. Right? That's a critical step. Think about that for a moment, what that means. That is killer. So those parties transacted up here in that agreement placed that immutable record out there. At some point later in time, right, it was able to fetch and be verified and validated by that finance company. That's the magic right there. It's validated. Step 8, request financing. Assesses credit rating, runs a Bayesian model to make our decision. And now we send back our tokens, which is our digital money. And then those tokens are then transferred from Joe's to Mary. Mary got her funding. So take a second and look at that. Questions? You see the power in that? How these disconnected parties, utilizing these blockchain channels, are able to collaborate without giving up information, and that financier can make decisions. They never had to pick up the phone and call Blue Sky and say, hey, I got this request over here, I need to verify. No. And how this can be automated. At volume, at scale. It could be $1 billion transaction or a dollar transaction. It could be for the exchange of any kind of fungible or non-fungible asset. It doesn't have to be for money. It could be for some kind of a right, some kind of a privilege. It could even be an actuator. Open a door. Let them in a classroom. Let them out of prison. Graduate them. What was the outcome of that surgery? Discussion time. Anybody want to discuss it?
Can you,
Can you go back one slide?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Which one do you want to go back to?
The one before this one. There we go. Thanks.
This one?
Yeah. Sorry, I just wanted to look at it a little longer.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you. You had a question?
can you explain a little more about the 11, 12 steps? The role of the tokens?
Yeah, that's money in this case, digital money. Okay, so in our world, in hemp chain or in our supply chain, the SEC recognizes, as well as probably the leading financial center of the world, London, Great Britain, that there's basically three types of tokens: security token, right, utility token, and exchange token. And the exchange token is what this really is. Okay, so what's great about that is means that that is not recognized as a security, so it's not regulated, and it's not a utility token. So even though they say, well, utility tokens right now don't really have to be regulated, but you have to look at them case by case. So what's a utility token? You know, in the world you want to equate it to would be like ether, gas, in Ethereum. Okay, you have to spend ether gas, which they call gas, but it's ether, in order to make the smart contract run. But where you get that from? You have to take fiat, your money, your cash, go to some place and buy ether, their tokens. Now, is that a security? That's the question. That's the liability, big liability today. Okay, when you buy that, it's certainly, certainly it can be looked at as money, right? But money is not necessarily a security. But if you're buying money, then you're going to be subject to regulation, right? Especially if you're transmitting and you're dealing in that. So this, though, in this case here, in our case, the SEC is already issuing no action letters if you draft the right statements and submit it to them and how you're using tokens. If you're using tokens within your ecosystem, so in this case, this is where Mary Jane wants to buy 2 tons of seed. And that's going to cost her $150,000. But Mary Jane isn't going to use her credit card or write a check, because Mary Jane belongs to this supply chain ecosystem called hemp chain. And Mary Jane has an account, like a bank account, right? And she put in $1 million that she got funded in cash from the financier. And she bought, you know, 1 billion tokens, whatever. Well, actually, no. Let's just make it simple, because it is one-to-one. So she got a $2 million loan. She bought $2 million of tokens. But what the chain does is it takes those tokens. It's an asset sale. Okay, so she gets those. What did I say? 2 million. 2 million tokens go into her wallet, right? And the cash goes into is handed over to a third-party independent fiduciary that runs a trust. Okay, so $2 million is sitting in a Rothschild trust under Mary's name. Okay, her cash, and she has 2 million tokens. She can go and exchange 150,000 of those tokens with Larry, the seed guy. And it's an immediate transaction running through this. Okay? Except the verification here is really now about, well, there's no verification because the tokens are the tokens. Right? It's a simple exchange. It's not a financial exchange, right? So don't confuse that. Okay? It's just a simple exchange. So now, in the scenario though, there is a transfer of assets from account A to account B, from Mary's account to Larry the seed guy. He just picked up 150,000 tokens. She just got debited 150,000 tokens. Okay? Not money. Okay? At some point in time, Larry the seed guy wants cash. Okay? Now he's going to go to a third party, an exchange that we have a contract with. Okay? And say, hey, yeah, I got 150,000 hemp chain tokens, right? And I want 150,000 American dollars. So now that's a separate outside transaction managed by that third party fiduciary running a trust. And all they do is just do a simple transaction and debit credit, take and burn those tokens. Done. You can't take those tokens and go to Walmart. Okay? It's not Libra, what Facebook wants to do. Okay? Libra, you have to read the Libra paper. They want you to believe it's what I just described to you, but it's not. It's not. Because of the parties involved. Okay? They're a bank. They're a Federal Reserve. They're supplanting our fiat. This is not. Okay? That's why the SEC recognizes this. There's already businesses doing this. There's already been no action letters issued. If you describe it the way that I just told you, you're good to go. You're not selling a security. It's not an investment. It's an exchange token between two parties. Okay? It's no different than me buying a car from you, right?
Right.
Because the third party out there is yeah, okay, you got it. So that's the breakthrough, sort of, right? Simplistic, it's a breakthrough. Does that answer your question?
Yes.
So in a regular blockchain, there's somebody that calculates the hash to give you a code. Who calculates the hash in this instance? Who takes responsibility for the processing of the...
Well, hashes are everywhere.
Okay.
So, I mean, the hash, I mean, it's like, that's really, to me, that's an open-ended question because hashes are like used everywhere. There's Merkle hash, there's a cryptographic hash when you do a signature, there's a hash when you're doing consensus transactions, when you're, so can you be more specific?
Like Bitcoin relies on...
So now you're talking about consensus.
Right.
Yeah. So in this case, it's Raft. The latest version is called Raft Consensus.
Okay.
So it's a leader follower. So there's, I haven't looked at the actual code, so I'm not going to say there's no hashing involved, because hashing is a cryptographic function, right?
Exactly.
So it's just a means of verifying something,
Yep.
right? So if I take a hat and I put a bunch of numbers in it, and there's 10 numbers in there and one of them is different, and I pass it around and you all just pull it out, and you run a hash on that number, right?
Right.
Then whoever has the same, somebody in the room will have a different hash. But the other 9 will agree.
It's not computationally expensive, there's not that many parties involved, so it's not that demanding.
Yeah, oh, no. No, not at all. In fact, with Raft, which is one of the, actually Raft has been around for a while, and I mean the original one was like called Paxos, but Raft is a consensus model where you have a leader who's responsible for doing the commits, right? And people, basically you send out something, they check it, they send it back to you, and it's the responsibility of the leader. Once he gets X, And it's a threshold. So let's say that you set up your raft equation. It says, I'm going to send it out to 10 people. And the first 4 that I get back that match, I know it's good. And I'm going to commit. I don't have to wait for all 10. Some will be more strict and say, I'm not going to commit this until I get back all 10. And they all got to be equal. Am I going on?
No, that's cool. Who's the leader in this scenario?
Well, in this scenario, if we have to go back to the blockchain, in this scenario, it would be probably the administrator would be the leader, because it's just a two-party. Yeah. But that's too simplistic, right? Because what is it? Because when I saw a node, think of that's a logical entity. That node may actually be 4 servers, 4 instances. And then the other side, the administrator, the gold one, has, say, 8 instances. So there's 12 instances running, right? Out of those 12, randomly, one's elected as leader. Okay?
Yeah. How do you calculate the randomness?
Well, that's done by the equation. It's just a pure...
Randomization.
Huh?
Who agrees to the randomization?
It doesn't matter. Yeah, it's just random. It doesn't matter,
Yes.
right? And then, but it's really about resilience, because if the leader goes down for some reason, then a new leader is elected. But if you're looking, at, yeah, it's random. What's the random equation? I can't tell you without looking at the code. But in the case of like Sawtooth, which we also use, it's really based upon SGX, which is a firmware chip that has effectively a clock, right? A crystal ticking clock, right? And what happens there is the way they run it is you ask when you run, you do an API call to the SGX. Now that SGX is a sandbox, right? So you can't get into it, right? So it's secure. It's just what they call it, enclave, secure enclave. You can't F with it, right? You just send a call to it, and it sends you back a number. And that's whatever the crystal is, whatever tick is, the tick time. So it's just a number, right? Is that number random? No, it's a ticking number. Okay? But the way the algorithm works is you have, say, 5 parties. They all go ask their clock, give me a number. And then they all submit, they all talk to each other. What's your number? What's your number? What's your number? And then whoever has the lowest number becomes leader. So it's a lottery. All of them are lotteries. Bitcoin is a lottery. Right? It's just a matter of how you draw the ball, how you pick the ball. In the case of Bitcoin, right, they're just running SHA-256, right? But they have a pattern that says, oh yeah, you got to find 18 zeros. Okay? And that's been mathematically figured out that, well, we have, I'll just throw it out, 18 terahashes running on average a second. So that means that we need 18 zeros, and with that much terahash running, statistically it says that within 10 minutes, somebody will find that number. But how do you find the number? Brute force, sequentially. I mean, you could randomly pick a number, but you're not going to find it any faster than if you start at 0 and just start running the equation, right? So that's why it's unfair and not secure, because he who owns the most hash power finds the number. Fast, the first.
Like I'm in Finland.
Unless you find a zero day in the Bitcoin algorithm, right? But that's not really, you can't really do that because the hash algorithm is simplistic. Right? But that doesn't mean that you can't invent hardware that might figure it out. And there could be a mathematical shortcut. He's giving me the 15 minutes. Alan.
Mark, for this type of project, what are the pros and cons of using Hyperledger versus Quarter?
Oh yeah, well, Cord is a DLT, first of all.
Yeah.
Okay, so there's no consensus. Okay, it's just strictly signature driven.
Okay.
Right? So the pro to that is faster throughput.
Okay.
So if you're looking at chunking through a bunch of financial transactions as fast as you can at bulk, then you don't need consensus because you're relying upon a regulated environment with penalty, remediation, insurance. All you need is your signature, right? That bank's signature, and that bank's signature. And that goes back to this gentleman's question, the hashing. How you generate your signatures, right? Cryptographically secure. But the point is that they're not looking at writing something to the ledger where everybody agrees by consent. There's no consensus. And it's the consensus that's the bottleneck of blockchain. So blockchain really is a subset. If you draw a picture, there's DLT, and then there's blockchain. And what separates the two is that blockchain adds a consensus model, and the academic race and the enterprise race, mathematical breakthrough, right? IBM was using practical Byzantine fault tolerance, okay? And now with the current version, they're using Raft. So the difference is that Raft, again, is a leader-follower. So it's much faster if you have a leader, right? So everybody says, I'm the leader, let me be the leader, all right? And then we hand out the equation, 1 + 1. Okay, and then we set a threshold. So I say, okay, so there's 8 of us. So statistically, if the first 5 that I receive give me the right hash back that I calculate, then I'm accepting that and I'm writing it. Okay?
What about credit rating? Because they are moving over the time, so maybe we have some change in credit rating. How do you fix that?
I'm sorry.
For example, now my credit rating is AAA, and after 2 days going to be BBBs. So how can affect the model is changing in the credit rating?
Oh, the credit rating.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely. That's a good point because it is dynamic.
Exactly.
It is dynamic. Yeah. So at what point in time, and that's the policy question, right? So ideally, right? And it's a risk equation, right? Because you're going to be much more. It's like Starbucks and the bank, right? If it's a $2 deal, right? Actuarially, you can get ripped off many times and still make a lot of money, right? But if you're a bank and you're writing $1 million loans, right? That means when you get to this stage right here, that might take, in the case of Starbucks, they might short circuit it. It's like, what was his last rating online? What's in the chain? Good. When was it taken? 3 months ago. I don't care. But it was good, right? But if it's the $1 million finance, okay, what was his credit rating? When was it taken? Oh, no, we need a new one. So now you're going to do what's called off-chain. So now it's going to issue outside this to a third party. Go get the current record. Go get the current check.
You have to apply the Bayesian approach again, given the new.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because then actually you would just end up extending this model, right? Because you want all the same safeguards put in place. Because that is a supply chain too, right? Because you have a provider. That provider has different sources to validate your credit, right? They're going to get that, then they're going to sign off on it, and they're going to write it to the ledger, to the blockchain, right? And then you're going to go and verify that they just wrote, and it has to be within the last 2 minutes. Ha. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
So from a lender perspective, is it fair to say that having the blockchain structure basically help the lender to finance people that were lower on the supply chain that were not financeable because you can identify them? And then you also manage the risk of your supply chain, because before you used to finance someone but without taking into consideration whether people down on the supply chain will be able to get the financing or not. And thirdly, is just preventing fraud.
Yeah.
So is this
All three of those. Absolutely. Yeah. And there's one other thing, just we're going to have to break up, but one thing I want to also interject. I didn't want to confuse, convolute this, but there's a new technology coming online. You'll hear about it probably a lot with maybe in the next 2 years, 18 months, 2 years, maybe sooner, called zero knowledge. So effectively what these are, zero knowledge is a black box, and they get set up, right? So the inputs come in, and they're set up, and then basically they allow you to query the black box and ask it questions without it having to reveal information to you. So the best way to look at it is like using that technology in the future. You could go to a bar, and you won't have to. Using that technology, you won't have to show personally identifiable information in order to get a loan. I know it's a mind bender, but it's called zero knowledge. And there's 2 terms right now that are really, the Israeli researchers are really way ahead on this, but there's a term called snarks and starks. So S-N-A-R-K and S-T-A-R-K. The math has been around for coming out of information theory, but it's been around, I think, for about maybe 15 years. But it's advancing really rapidly, quick. But it's all about, again, being able to prove something between 2 parties without either party giving identifiable information. So it's like, I can prove I'm 18 without giving you, and you'll get back a proof that gives you a reliability, a high enough rating that allows you to believe it, because you trust in the algorithm, because you know the algorithm can't be fooled. But at the same time, it's interactive. You have to ask it, right? And right now, it doesn't scale because of the way the protocol works with the black box. Effectively, it's sort of like asking someone something 10,000 times. A liar will mess it up. But if they're telling the truth, they'll give you the same answer like 99.9% of the time. But if they're lying, they'll probably give it to you 70% of the time. And the black box will tell you yes or no. But it's important to understand that, because that's going to really add a lot to the things that we're talking about, because then you won't have to, in the area of like know your customer and anti-money laundering, that's the killer right there, because the whole thing about know your customer is a very rigorous exercise, and it's very labor intensive, cost intensive, and full of liability. But in the future, with this black box zero knowledge, it's like I can go and set it up with my information. I'll do it one time, the labor, and then 1 million lenders can ask it for a penny and have no liability, and they'll know the customer without having to know me. It's crazy, right? I hope I didn't confuse you on that. Okay.